Good evening. Welcome to lesson 4 of BookSmart, in which we are trying to cover over 3,000 years of Jewish study. The area of Jewish study that we will address today is Halacha, the field of Torah law. And we'll introduce this topic with reading two texts that will give us an understanding of the level of importance and I guess an overall understanding of what halacha is. And if you look at the timeline map, we are holding on the orange line, which is the third line from the top, halachic works, the works that cover Jewish law. And it's really a natural flow from last week's lesson, which was about the Talmud, and the prior week's lesson, which was about the Midrash. The Midrash and the Talmud naturally lead straight into Halacha, Jewish law, as we shall soon see. So let's have the first look at text number 1 on page 148. This is a quote from the Torah, from the book of Exodus, chapter 18, verse 20. The verse reads as follows. Instruct them, God says to Moses, on the statutes and on the teachings. Make known to them the way on which they should go and the actions they should do. And what does that verse mean? Let's have a look at text 2, which was from the famed philosopher and rabbi known by his acronym, the Maharal of Prague, the 16th century sage from Prague. And he says as follows. The word Torah means instruction, as in the word hora'ah. For the function of the Torah is to instruct us in the actions that we should do. That is why it is specifically the 5 books of Moses that are called Torah, as they contain the mitzvahs. So as we have seen up until this point, the Torah contains lots of wisdom. Wisdom, history, culture, philosophy, and so on and so forth. It contains a tremendous wealth of information as we've been studying up until this point. But above all, the word Torah means instruction. The Torah is a guide for life. In everything we do, there's a godly way of doing it. Everything we do, literally everything. From the moment we're born to the moment a person passes, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, everything is something that we do, and there's always a godly way of doing it. And so this set of rules, the divine set of rules on how we do things, is the halacha part of Torah, the Jewish law part of Torah. That's what halacha means. Halacha has in it the do's and don'ts of life. You see, the Talmud, which we've discussed at length last week, and the Midrash from 2 weeks ago, has lots of information. And as we discussed earlier, that's what Jewish learning is all about. In Talmudic learning, we have all different aspects of the Torah, and we have everything involved in it. We apply our minds to engage with the Torah, to make it our Torah, partnership between us and God. And it covers many angles. We try to understand the biblical laws and its ideas, various explanations of them, opposing views. Everything ultimately is part of Torah, but all of this is about the learning aspect of Torah. The ultimate function of Torah is to serve as instruction, to give us concrete guidance on what to do when we wake up in the morning, what to do when Shabbos comes, what to do when we get in our car, what to do, what are the practical level steps that we need to take, the path on which they should go, as we read in the verse, and the actions that they should do. This is the halacha aspect of Torah. Now, what does the word halacha mean? Halacha literally means the way, going, to be on the move. What does that mean? It means quite simply, halacha, Jewish law, is something that helps us pick our journey, our way. We're standing at a crossroads. We have 2 options. Do we do option A? Do we do option B? We're static. We don't know what direction to go. Halacha guides us to go, to be on our way. Which direction shall we take? whether it's at times when one direction is prohibited and the other is permitted, or two directions that both seem to be legitimate views, and we don't know which view is the correct view to take. Which view is the view that I should take at this moment? And so that is what halacha is. Halacha is the mechanism by which these issues are decided and the books that instruct the end user of the Jewish way of life. So while the Talmud is all the background, lots of questions, lots of opinions, it's kind of hard to get to the bottom. The books of halacha, of Jewish law, is what gives us the bottom line, the do's and the don'ts. Now, halacha addresses every single part of life. Halacha addresses every single part of life. As I mentioned, from when we wake up, how we should wake up, what we should do immediately upon waking, the order of the prayers. If one is in a synagogue, how should they pray? How is the Kaddish said? What portions of the Torah should be read? How should they be read? What we should eat, how we should eat it. What is a kosher kitchen? What is kosher? What is not kosher? Going throughout the day, it comes to a business. What should we do through business? What should we not do in business? What is permitted to be doing in business? What type of businesses are permitted? When we go for leisure trips, there's laws about that. When we go to sleep, there's laws on how to go to sleep. When we eat, there's laws on how to eat, what blessings to make, and so on and so forth. There are many, many laws that the Torah discusses. But we're going to take it a step further. Look at page 150. You see a map of the world. On the map of the world, you'll notice many, many little words. What these little words are, these are 35 different queries which were posed throughout the generations to a posek, various poskim, which is the plural of the singular posek, throughout the world and throughout various times. What is a posek? A posek is a rabbi with the knowledge, expertise, and standing to issue halachic rulings. He is called a posek, a deciser of Jewish law. These are 35 different questions, just a sampling of questions which come up in Jewish law that really addresses even greater questions. You see, the question of how do I put on tefillin is quite a simple question. How many Shabbos candles should I light is a simple question with a simple answer. But then there are more complex questions, questions that need real life, real time, involved, knowledgeable wisdom of a posek. Take, for example, one of the questions. Let's see the first question on the left, right? So you have a question from Atlanta. This was a question that was posed to a Rabbi Tobias Geffen not too long ago, 1935. The question was, is Coca-Cola kosher? Right, so there are simple questions. Is bacon kosher? Obviously not. Is an apple kosher? Obviously yes. Yes, there are complexities to that as well, but that's, right, these are simple questions. But then the question, Coca-Cola, is it kosher? Right, now we know it's kosher because it's got a rabbinic certification on the can of Coca-Cola. But in 1935, when it was a relatively new product, and rabbis were not necessarily given the secret ingredients of Coca-Cola, the question was posed to Rabbi Tobias Geffen, is it kosher or not? And he had to do his due diligence and figure it out. And if I'm not mistaken, should have checked this out before the class, but if I'm not mistaken, he was actually the first rabbi who was led into the Coca-Cola factory to understand the process, to see how it was done. And he actually gave his rabbinic certification on Coca-Cola in that year. That's, to a degree, a silly question because, yes, we can do without Coca-Cola as we do with many drinks. But then there's other questions that are quite serious. For example, let's proceed to the next question right below that on the left side on page 150. Right, this is a question in New York that was posed to the great decider of Jewish law, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in 1977 was asked a question about conjoined twins that shared a single six-chambered heart. Separating them would save the life of one of them, but kill the other. Should the procedure be performed or not? Halacha is not so much about emotions. It's about what does the Torah say about this scenario. Now, if you look through the Torah, there's no question in the Torah or in the Talmud about conjoined twins who shared a six-chambered heart. So now it's up to a rabbi like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a magnificent posek, perhaps the greatest that lived in the 20th century, to analyze the Talmud, analyze the Midrash, analyze the Torah, and come to a decision of what should be done in that case. Let's analyze another question, slightly different type of question, but let's look all the way at the bottom on the left page, on page 150, all the way on the bottom. This is from a city in Brazil called Entre Rios, and the question was posed to Rabbi Yosef Aaron Taran in 1894. Is the Muscovy duck a New World species kosher? See, when it comes to animals, we have clear directives of what makes an animal kosher. It has to chew its cud and have split hooves. When it comes to birds, there's no clear-cut rule in the Torah of what makes an animal kosher, what makes an animal non-kosher. The Torah just lists a series of birds and says these are non-kosher birds, implying seemingly, or it's there for us to infer, that all other birds are kosher. But because that isn't so clear, there's a rule in the Torah that any bird that may be kosher, there needs to be a clear tradition that this bird is kosher. Which now poses the question, if you find a New World species in the Americas, in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, these birds seem to be kosher because they're not one of the birds mentioned in the Torah as non-kosher. But on the other hand, there isn't a clear tradition because it's a New World species. The world never had such a bird. Is this bird kosher, permitted to be consumed or not? That was a question that was posed to the great decider of Jewish law, Rabbi Yosef Aaron Taran, in 1894. And one final question that we will address, and that is in the middle of page 151, right over Poland. There's a question that was posed to Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathanson in 1859. Sorry, the next question. To Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes in 1875. He was a great decider, rabbi of Jewish law. And the question was a pretty simple question to us. We know the answer. But in 1875, it was a real novel question. Can electricity be used on Shabbos? In 1875, electricity was brand new. In Lvov, of all places, of course it was new. And people had no real understanding of what electricity was. And so the question was, can electricity be used on Shabbos? Can I turn on a light on Shabbos? Nowadays, in 2023, we know the answer, which is it's an obvious, resounding no, we're not allowed to. But in 1875, that was a novel question. And Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes didn't have any precedent to rely on. He couldn't open the Talmud and say, hey, let's see what the Talmud says about electricity. He didn't have that. Nowadays, we have books of Jewish law that have addressed this question, and we now know the answer. But in 1875, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes had the task, because he was asked by people who deemed it a very practical question at the time. They were asking him, we have an electric lamp. Can we use it on Shabbos or not? And if you go through these 35 questions that are here, some of them are quite magnificent, some of them are quite important, some of them are matters of life and death. And again, the question isn't what we feel about it. We may have various feelings about it, and we may think, hey, it's not a big deal. But the question that we're asking here is, what does the Torah say about this situation? And now it's up to the individual posek to figure out what would the Torah say in this group. So, as we see here, Halacha deals with life and death dilemmas, and it also contains many lengthy discussions devoted to seemingly minor issues like what blessing should be made on a particular food. So why is that? Because the Torah is the way on which we should go and the actions that we should do. No issue is too small, no issue is too big to be addressed by halacha. Every single question is being addressed by halacha. Now, where did halacha come from? If we have the Talmud and we have the Midrash and it addresses all the questions, what exactly is halacha? So let's have a look on our timeline map, right? And look at the timeline that we have here. We now understand that halacha is an important part of Torah, and the reality is it always was an important part of Torah, and perhaps the most important because it's the part of Torah that gives us clear-cut direction on what to do and what not to do in every single aspect of life. Although it was always perhaps the most important part of the Torah, the composition of classical books of halacha, at least in the format that we know them today, is a relatively recent development. Because look at the timeline map, right? We have from the year 1300 before the Common Era, which is when the Torah was given, 1313, and it goes up for the next 13 centuries until year 1 of the Common Era, right? Almost no halachic books or no halachic works were authored. It was just the Talmud. And even if we continue the next 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years, there's still no halachic works which were authored. So if halacha is so important, what happened with that first 1800 years of Jewish study that there were no halachic works? And primarily, if you look at number 4, when did the halachic works start to be authored, as we know them today? Roughly in the year 600, only about 1400 years ago. So when we have the Talmud and we have the Midrash, those were all authored beginning right at the beginning of printing or publishing of the oral Torah. But when it comes to halacha, that seems to take place 600, 700, 800 years later. Why is that? So you'll notice that it's not an anomaly, because it's not just halacha, Jewish law, that has this idea of books being authored beginning in the 5th or 6th century. You'll see it the same by the yellow line, the light green, the dark green, the turquoise line, and the bottom line, the blue line, which represents philosophical works, Kabbalistic work, Hasidic works, biblical commentaries. All of these books seem to have been focused on the last 500 years. Why is that? Sorry, the last 1500 years, excuse me. Why is that? From the completion of the Talmud, right? This entire area, for the most part, barring a few works, for the Kabbalistic works, for the most part, these books all seem to have been written in the past 1500 years and not the first 700, 800 years of the oral Torah. And why is that? Specialized branches of Torah learning were developed after the completion of the Talmud. You see, the Talmud contains everything. All the subjects discussed within these individual books, be it the Jewish law books, be it the philosophy works, be it the Kabbalistic works, the Hasidic works, the Musar works, all these styles, these genres of Torah are all included in the magnificent work of the Talmud. The Talmud has all these types of teachings. But in the Talmud, as we saw last week in the Midrash 2 weeks ago, all these different types of teachings are woven together in the same ongoing narratives. It's primarily in the post-Talmudic era that when we find books that focus on one particular area of Torah, perhaps what we are most familiar with when you go to a store, right? A bookstore, or go to Amazon and you want to buy a book. You don't want to buy a book that has a little bit of everything. For the most part, we buy books that specialize in a specific area because that's how we are hardwired, and it's a lot easier to focus. When you buy a book that's only about philosophy, or you buy a book on law, or you don't buy a book that has a little bit of law, a little bit of philosophy, a little bit, and it all mixes together. When you want to find the answer to a question, you got to start flipping pages and going back and forth. And I want to study the philosophy within this book. So you got to read page 2, page 9, page 87, go back to page 55. It gets a little confusing. That's the way it is in the Talmud. These books, what was unique in them is following the era of the Talmud. Now these rabbis decided it's time to publish specialized books, books which have one particular area of Torah, whether it's a book that explores the philosophy in the Torah, or it's the book that explores the psychological teachings or the mystical dimensions and so on. Now is the time when they started publishing these individual topic books, and the same is for Halacha, for Jewish law. This is when these books began to be published, because all the raw material contained within Halacha is in the Talmud. But as they exist in the Talmud, they're all mixed together. They're included within the dense forest that includes proofs and counterproofs, opinions and counter-opinions, the legal aspect of the Torah, the case studies, everything else, the stories, the moral side of it, the philosophical side of those questions. It's all mixed together. And so if you want to study the legal aspect of the Torah, if you want to see a code, if you want to see a clear-cut handbook, what do I do in this case? What do I do in that case? It's only the after Talmud, the post-Talmudic era books that we have to go look at to find out what is the actual law on what we should do in these specific situations. And we'll give an example of what we mean. If you recall from last week, we said that the Talmud is split into two parts. There's the Mishnah, which is more concise and legalistic aspect of the laws. And then there is the Gemara, which discusses, analyzes, breaks it down. And on one 4-line Mishnah, you can have 10 pages of Gemara analyzing that Mishnah. So that would seem to imply that the Mishnah is that concise, clear-cut, end-user book for us to study. So here we'll give an example where we see a ruling in the Mishnah, but it's still not clear-cut, and we need a halachic book to clarify it for us. Let's have a look at text 3. These are the laws of Shema. We're going to read text 3, which are various laws pertaining to the recitation of Shema. And then we will read text 4, which are the same laws of the reading of the Shema, but in the halachic version written by Maimonides in the 11th century. Sorry, in the 12th century. And then we'll see the difference between the way it is in the Talmud and the way it is in the halachic book. So let's have a look at text 3. These are the laws of reading of the Shema, the way they are presented in the Talmud. Talmud begins. From when do we read Shema in the evening? From the time when the Kohanim enter to partake in their teruma, the tithings of food, until the end of the first watch. Right? They're giving us a time frame. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The sages say until midnight. It's not just until that initial time frame. The sages seem to argue with Rabbi Eliezer, and they say that, no, you can read the evening Shema until midnight. Rabbi Gamliel says, a third opinion, you can actually read it until dawn. Until dawn, you fulfill your obligation of reading the Shema in the evening. And the Talmud continues. It once happened that Rabbi Gamliel's sons returned from a party, and they said to him, we did not read the Shema. Said he to them, if dawn has not risen, you are obligated to read. Not only in this case, but in every case that the sages said until midnight, the mitzvah can be fulfilled until dawn. The mitzvah of burning of fats and limbs of the offerings in the holy temple is until dawn. For all the temple offerings that can be eaten for one day, the mitzvah is until dawn. If so, why did the sages say until midnight? In order to distance a person from transgressing. So right now we have the first law presented in the Talmud that when do we read the evening Shema? We have three opinions. And after the third opinion, it goes off to a side topic about a general rule that whenever the sages say until midnight, really the law is until dawn, and they were just trying to distance a person from transgressing, so they said until midnight, but in essence, they can go until dawn. That's the first law in the Talmud. Talmud continues with the second law. From when do we read Shema in the morning? Finish with the Shema in the evening. Now we'll move on to the Shema in the morning. First opinion of the Talmud is from when a person can distinguish between sky blue and white. Is it light enough to distinguish between those two colors? At that time is when you're permitted to begin saying the morning Shema. Second opinion, Rabbi Eliezer says, from when a person can distinguish between sky blue and leek green. Now, to distinguish between sky blue and white doesn't have to be that light because there's quite distinct colors. But to distinguish between sky blue and leek green, it has to be a little lighter. So Rabbi Eliezer is arguing on the first opinion. So we have two opinions. And until when can it be said? First opinion, and one should finish it until sunrise. You have up until sunrise to say the Shema. Rabbi Yeshua says until 3 hours into the day, as that is the habit of royalty to rise at 3 hours. So again, we have a second law, the Shema in the morning. We have two opinions from when it can be said, and we have two opinions until when morning goes that one can fulfill their obligation to read the Shema. And now we have a third law. The sages of the school of Shammai said, in the evening, every person should recline while reading the Shema, and in the morning they should stand, as it is written, when you lie down and when you rise. Then there's a counter opinion. The sages of the school of Hillel say, every person should read after their manner. You can read it lying down, sitting down, lying, standing, it makes no difference, as it is written, and when you go on your way. If so, why does it say when you lie down and when you rise, at the time when people lie down and the time when people rise? So here we have three laws of the recitation of the Shema. Right now, if you're like me and you don't have any prior knowledge of the laws of Shema, this passage seems a little confusing. Plus, it's got a lot of added information and opinions, and I still don't know what I should do. When do I say Shema? Do I have to wait until I can decipher between green and blue, or is it enough to decipher between blue and white? Do I have to say the Shema of the morning before sunrise, or do I have until 3 hours? Do I have to say the evening Shema before midnight, before dawn? So yes, it's there in the Talmud, but I'm missing some more information. So now let's look in the words of Maimonides in text form, page 155. The same laws. What does he say? It begins as follows, text form. The Shema is read twice every day, in the evening and in the morning, as it is written, when you lie down and when you rise. Meaning, during the time when people lie down to sleep, which is at night, and during the time when people get up, which is at day. What does one read? What is included in the recitation of the Shema? 3 Torah portions. These are Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Ve'ahavta, and it will be, V'hayim Shemaya, and God said, Shema V'hayim Shemaya and Vayomer, and God said, reading these 3 portions in this order is what is called reading the Shema. When is the time for reading the Shema? In the evening, the mitzvah can be fulfilled from when the stars come out until midnight. However, if a person transgressed and delayed, as long as they read the Shema before dawn, they have fulfilled their obligation, as the rule until midnight was only set in order to distance a person from negligence. When is its time by day? The mitzvah is to begin reading before sunrise so as to conclude the reading of the Shema and make the last blessing which follows the Shema with the rising of the sun. This interval is about 1/10 of an hour before sunrise. One who delayed and read the Shema after sunrise has fulfilled their obligation, as the time for reading the Shema for one who delayed is until the end of the first 3 hours of the day. What are the main differences for you between text 3 and text 4, between the way these laws are presented in the Talmud versus the way these laws are presented in Halacha, and in this case, in Maimonides' book of Jewish law? So let's have a look. In the Mishnah and the Talmud, the basic laws of the mitzvah are missing, right? If you look at text 3, it doesn't tell us that there is a law to read Shema. It doesn't either tell us what is included in the reading of the Shema. It assumes that the reader already knows these basic parts of the law. As we read earlier in last week's class, that the Mishnah was written at a time when the sages were worried that people would forget parts of Torah, parts of the oral Torah. And so the sages transcribed the parts that they thought were at risk of being lost. The parts that they thought would never be lost, the basics, they didn't transcribe. So in the Mishnah with the laws of Shema, it doesn't say anywhere what is included in the reading of the Shema. Nor does it say that there is an obligation to read the Shema. But if you look in the in the book of Halacha, in the Mishnah Torah, which is the name of the Halachic book of Maimonides, he begins right away with the basics. A, there is a law to read the Shema. B, this is what's included when we say you need to read the Shema. It's these 3 paragraphs. Secondly, there's a difference. In the Talmud, it records all the different legal opinions. And it leaves it up to the reader to know which one should be followed. In the books of Jewish law, it only records the final halachic ruling. And finally, in the Mishnah, it bundles together different types of laws. We had the laws of the temple, and we had the laws of the Shema, and we had the laws of eating the tithing, and we had the laws of the fats and limbs of the sacrifice being burning on the temple. In the Code of Jewish Law, we only had the laws of the Shema, and we had it quite orderly. It was organized. It built it up. There is a law to read the Shema. This is what's included in reading the Shema. This is how it needs to be read, and these are the times that it should be read from this time up until this time. It's clear, it's concise, it's straightforward. So if someone wanted to know the laws of the Shema and they opened the Talmud, they'd be at a loss. But if someone wanted to know the laws of the Shema, they open the book of Jewish law, they have it clear cut. It's there. It's all spelled out for them. Why is that? What's the reason for this change in the nature of the written works of the oral Torah after the closing of the Talmud? That suddenly there needed to be a concise, straightforward, written in an organized fashion. Okay. It's a commercial break by Rob. So why was there this need? Why was there this change? And in the Talmud, we don't find that it's so organized and so codified and so straightforward with do's and don'ts. Whereas when it comes to the works of the Mishnah Torah, which was compiled about 1,000 years after the Mishnah, and various other halachic books that were written, suddenly they're written in a concise form. And the answer to that lies in Maimonides' own explanation that we read last week at great length. And we're not going to reread it again, but we'll just give a general overview. And that is when the Talmud was completed at the end of the Talmudic era, at the end of the 5th century of the Common Era, it represented the single most authoritative documentation of the knowledge and wisdom of the oral Torah, and was acknowledged as such by the entire Jewish world. The Talmud was the last such work to have that status. As Maimonides explained, that we read last week, as Maimonides explained, that following the closing of the Talmud, the Jewish people were gradually becoming more dispersed. And the change didn't happen overnight. It happened and developed gradually over about 500 years from the 5th century up until the 10th century. During this period, these 5 centuries, from the completion of the Talmud until Maimonides wrote his book and other sages wrote their halachic books, during the period of the 500 years, Babylonia continued to serve as a center for Jewish life, and this period is known as the Geonim, which is what the heads of the Babylonian yeshivas at that time, following the completion of the Talmud, were called. Jews living in any part of the world other than Babylonia would send all their questions in Torah and Jewish law to these Geonim that lived in Babylonia. But a number of factors ultimately diminished the authority and influence of the Babylonian Geonim, that by the beginning of the 10th century, there was no longer one global center of learning Torah, nor was there one central authority for Torah law. Each community had its own yeshivas, its own houses of study, its own Torah leaders, and its own halachic authorities. What were those reasons? What were those factors? There were declines of the yeshiva in Babylonia. There was increasing difficulties in travel and communications. There was the development of centers of Torah and Torah learning in other parts of the world, in Spain and North Africa and Western Europe. And under these new circumstances, the learning of Torah was transitioning from a model of exclusively learning from people to learning from books. Because in addition to learning from teachers, which remained the primary vehicle of Torah's transmission through these years and through the generations up until today, really, there was now a need for an additional element of learning from the books. In other words, during the Talmudic era, the function of the written books of the oral Torah was to help the student of Torah remember what they learned from their teachers. In the post-Talmudic era, including nowadays, these books began to serve also as sources of knowledge and learning themselves. There was now a need for books that were self-contained sources of Torah knowledge, which is why this is when those books began to be written. If you look back at your fold-out, at your timeline map, you'll see that idea. That's why these books started to be written, because now there was a need not just for books to confirm and to review what they have studied already, but now it was books that needed to be the teachers themselves. So now everything needed to be clear, concise, straightforward, unified in an organized fashion, specialized books. So if one needs to know the law of Shema, they can open up the laws of Shema. If one needs to know the laws of marriage, they can open the book of the laws of marriage. And if one needs to know what is the philosophy of the Torah, they can open up a book of philosophy, because now the purpose of the books changed. So now we have all these books, right? And if you look at line number 4 on the map, you'll see there's a response of the Gaonim. There's the Halacha Gedolah. There's the Alfasi. There's the Mishnah Torah, the Rush, the Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, the Chabad. They're all written in chronological order that are presented here. And this is a mere sprinkling of the thousands of halachic books that were written. So say you're a rabbi and you want to figure out these laws, the law of how do you turn on a light? Is a light permissible to be turned on Shabbos? The rabbi has to be well versed in all of these books, including and beginning from the Torah, the prophets, the scriptures, the Talmud, the Midrash, and so on, and then these books from the halachic sages. What are all these books, and how does one fit into the other? What is the timeline? So if you turn your book sideways and you look at page 158, figure 4.2, there's quite a dizzying array of little square boxes. So we're going to present a video clip here that's a little bit on the longer side, but it's quite fascinating as it goes through these works presented on this pullout, giving us a brief overview of the, I guess, chronological order and build up or build down of the basic and foundational halachic works. Just a minute. There we go.
A key book in the Library of Judaism is the Shulchan Aruch, also known as the Code of Jewish Law. The Shulchan Aruch is often described as the Jew's user manual for life. What's in the Shulchan Aruch? When was it written? Who wrote it? Why does the Shulchan Aruch, among the many other books on Jewish practice written over the centuries, occupy such a unique place on the Jewish bookshelf? The Shulchan Aruch is actually a combination of two different works composed in the 16th century in two different places by two different authors. To understand what these two great Torah sages achieved, we first need to take a closer look at the field of Halacha, Torah law. Halacha is the bottom line of Judaism, where the Torah's teachings translate into the do's and don'ts of daily life. It covers every area of life, from religious ritual to business dealings to interpersonal relationships. In all these and more, the Torah teaches us right from wrong and shows us how to lead a righteous and godly life. Where do these laws and practices come from? Basically, Halacha has three sources. The first source of Halacha is biblical law, which derives from the text of the Torah, as expounded by the Halachic Midrashim and the Talmud. Halacha also includes rabbinical laws, rules and regulations enacted by the Torah sages of each generation, by the authority vested in them in the Torah. Finally, Jewish practice includes minhagim, customs arising from Jewish life and hallowed by generations of practice. In each generation, Torah scholars and halachic authorities called poskim authored books documenting and discussing these laws. This chart lists some of the primary books of halacha written over the centuries. Let's take a closer look at the tree of halacha depicted here. You will notice that the halachic works fall under four general categories. One type is the halachic codes, marked in blue on this chart. A code is a book that organizes laws by subject. Halachic codes focus primarily on the final rulings and practical applications, rather than the laws, sources, reasons, and divergent opinions. A second type of halachic work is halachic commentaries, marked in red. A commentary is a work written as an accompaniment to an earlier work. The commentary discusses and explains the parent work. It may also cite opinions from other sources and argue with other commentaries on how to understand parent work. A third type of halachic works is halachic digests of the Talmud, marked in green. A digest is a summary of an earlier work. For example, the Talmud contains many halachic rulings, but these are obscured by the profusion of discussions, disputations, and case studies. The halachic digests of the Talmud isolate these rulings from the Talmudic text. The fourth type of halachic works is halachic responsa, marked in yellow. A responsum is a written response by a halachic authority to a specific halachic question that's presented to him. A typical responsum may run for many pages, citing and analyzing dozens of sources from the Talmud, the Talmudic commentaries, the halachic codes, and their commentaries, as well as previous responsa. It will then weigh the merits of several proposed solutions before rendering its decision. Now that we have defined the various types of halachic works, let us take a tour of the tree of halachic works you see here on the screen, and learn about the books and authors that represent major milestones in the history of halacha. The most primary source of Torah law is, of course, the Torah itself, which contains the 613 mitzvot, or biblical commandments, along with the laws communicated to Moses at Sinai and transmitted orally through the generations. For many generations, these laws, as well as the detailed explanations of the laws written in the Torah, were transmitted by word of mouth from teacher to disciple, until they were recorded in the very first halachic code, the Mishnah, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi 1800 years ago. The next major documentation of Torah law was the voluminous commentary on the Mishnah known as the Talmud. The Talmud records many thousands of discussions by hundreds of sages extending over 7 generations and more than 300 years. When the Talmud was redacted in the beginning of the 6th century, it was the most comprehensive record of Torah law compiled up until that point. After the Talmud came the Gaonim, who for 500 years headed the great Torah academies in Babylonia. The Gaonim wrote commentaries and digests on the Talmud. They also authored numerous responses to halachic queries that were sent to them from Jewish communities all across the world. During the Gaonic era, the entire Jewish world looked to the great yeshivot of Babylonia as the authority on all matters of Torah law. But beginning in the 11th century, a period known as the era of the Rishonim, there emerged centers of Torah learning throughout the Jewish diaspora, in North Africa, Spain, and Western and Southern Europe. One of the early Rishonim was Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, known as Rif, who lived and taught in Morocco and Spain. The Rif authored the most important halachic work of his time, a halachic digest of the Talmud. Another important digest of the Talmud was compiled about 250 years later by the Rosh. The Rishonim also authored many of the great commentaries on the Talmud, without which the Talmud would be a closed book to us today. While these commentaries are not halachic works per se, their explanations and discussions of Talmudic passages determine how many points of Torah law are applied. The Rishonim also wrote many thousands of halachic responsa, applying their Talmudic knowledge to issues of the day. But the most important developments in the literature of halacha in this period are two major halachic codes. The first is the Halachic Code, completed in the year 1180 by Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, or the Rambam. Maimonides titled his code Mishnah Torah, which means review of the Torah. Indeed, Mishnah Torah is the only halachic code that covers all areas of Torah law, including laws pertaining to the service in the Holy Temple and the agricultural laws that apply only in the land of Israel. Mishnah Torah systemized all the laws in the Talmud, as well as the rulings of the Gaonim during the nearly 700 years from the closing of the Talmud to Maimonides' own time. But as monumental and comprehensive a work this code was, it would still not be the final word on halacha. New halachic questions kept on being raised. Furthermore, not all of the halachas agreed with Maimonides' conclusions. For example, the Ravad, Rav Avraham ben David of Puskeris, authored glosses on the Mishnah Torah in which he presents his disagreements with one of Maimonides' rulings. Consequently, in the generations following Maimonides, many more halachic works of all four types, digests, codes, commentaries, and responsa, were written. About 150 years after Maimonides, a major halachic code was compiled in Spain by Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the son of the Rosh. While this code was more limited in that it only included laws that were relevant to Jewish life at that time, it expanded on Maimonides' code by including rulings from dozens of halachic works composed parallel to Maimonides' code and in the generations that followed. Rabbi Yaakov organized his code into 4 turim, or columns, each covering a different area of halacha: Orach Chaim, way of life; Yoreh Deah, instructor of knowledge; Even HaEzer, stone of salvation; and Choshen Mishpat, breastplate of judgment. After the Torah published his code, many great halachists wrote commentaries on this work. As we will see, 2 of these commentaries form the basis for the next major halachic code, the Shulchan Aruch. During the era of the Rishonim, 2 primary schools of halacha had formed, each with its own unique customs and traditions. The Sephardic school, followed by the Jewish communities of Spain, Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and the Ashkenazic school, followed by the communities of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. For example, Rif and Maimonides were both Sephardic sages. On the other hand, the author of the Torah tended more toward the rulings and customs of the Ashkenazic traditions, contained in the works of the Tosafists, his father the Rosh, and other Ashkenazic halachic authorities. The beginning of the 16th century saw a shift of focus among the halachists. These Acharonim, or later sages as they're called, did not, as a rule, consider themselves qualified to argue with the Torah sages of earlier generations, the Rishonim. Thus, while the Rishonim looked to the Talmud and the writings of the Gaonim as their primary sources of halachic rulings, the halachic works, composed by the Acharonim, focus on navigating the rulings and opinions of the Rishonim. The same is true of the 2 great sages, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, both of the first generation of Acharonim who gave us the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the product of 2 earlier works by these 2 halachic giants. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a commentary on the Torah which he titled Beis Yosef, the House of Yosef. In this work, Caro developed a distinctive approach to deciding between differing rulings among the halachists. He regarded three major halachists, Rif, Maimonides, and Rosh, as the big three. Whenever he encountered a difference of opinion among the early halachists, he would decide the law according to the majority view among these three. Rabbi Yosef Caro then proceeded to compile a code of his own, the Shulchan Aruch, which means set table. The Shulchan Aruch follows the same four-column format as that of the Torah, chapter by chapter. But Rabbi Yosef Caro felt that the Torah's rulings tended more toward those of the Ashkenazic Rishonim. In his code, he implemented his big three halachic approach, which gave more weight to the Sephardic halachic traditions. While Rabbi Yosef Caro was writing his Shulchan Aruch in the city of Tzfat, the Ashkenazic halachist Reb Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, was also laboring to codify the halachic rulings of the Rishonim. Ramah had also written a running commentary on the Torah and was creating his own halachic code. But when Caro's Shulchan Aruch was published in 1563, Ramah felt that his own work was now superfluous. So instead of publishing his own code of Jewish law, Ramah wrote glosses on Caro's Shulchan Aruch, in which he noted those areas in which he disagreed with Caro's conclusions and where he felt the need to add additional laws and customs not included in Caro's work. The two works were subsequently published together, with Ramah's glosses inserted in a different font within Rabbi Yosef Caro's text. The combined work, which essentially summarized the bottom line of halachic rulings up until their time, now became the fundamental code of Jewish law, on which hundreds of subsequent halachic commentaries and codes were authored, representing a great variety of customs and practices, but all looked to the Shulchan Aruch as the documentation of the grand halachic consensus, incorporating both of the two major halachic traditions of the Jewish people.
All right, so that was a not so brief overview of the process of coming to the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which was published in the mid-16th century. Now, before we move on to the next section of today's class, the first section was kind of an overview of Halacha and the introduction to what Halacha is. I just want to mention something that's pretty important. So as mentioned, Halacha stems many years, many books. And as you see right here, the Shulchan Aruch that was just discussed, the one that was concluded in roughly mid-16th century, upon which the second sage wrote his glosses and hundreds of other sages wrote their commentary. That is this set of books right here. It spans in this edition some, 40 volumes or 30 volumes right here. And then upon that, all of this is books on the Jewish law, the ones you can't see up there. That is all Jewish law. So that is the Shulchan Aruch, that black set right there with the orange lettering. Up there, for example, that blue set is, we mentioned at the beginning of the class, I mentioned the Decizer of Jewish Law. I said he was perhaps the greatest of the 20th century, by Moshe Feinstein. That is his responsa. That is 10 volumes of his responsa of Jewish law. That is a kind of a codification of Jewish law from the 19th century. That is also a certain codification of Jewish law from the 18th century. That is a more modern collection, the top shelf there of Jewish law that's still in the process of being published. Kind of updated the laws, updated questions, updated discussions of technology issues that that only arose in the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. As well as there continues, there's responsa there, that set there, that black one there, if you can see it over there, that is responsa from the Rishonim, responsa from the earliest sages of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. That is their responsa, about the 8 sages responsa there. And so on and so forth, these shelves on the bottom as well, that's further halachic works. Now that can seem all quite overwhelming. If I want to know Jewish law, do I have to read all of these books? These books over here we'll get to next week. Actually, in 2 weeks. We'll get to those books in 2 weeks. And the books on top over there, those two shelves we'll get to next week. But either way, all of this can seem quite overwhelming. If I want to know Jewish law, what do I do? And perhaps when we get to the second half of today's class, the second section, will be even more overwhelmed. As you will see, it's quite a complex halachic issue that we're going to try to figure out what the answer is. But halacha isn't necessarily complex when it comes to the user end. In other words, for our day-to-day life, most of these questions aren't the questions that we will be analyzing. For our day-to-day life, the second section that we will be asking, and the questions that we posed in the beginning, those 35 questions of conjoined twins and what to do with the new bird, these are not questions that you and I are encountering every day. What do we do if we want to know the law of questions that we encounter every day? What blessing do I make on water? How do I daven? Do I need to study all of these books? Do I need to go through an overwhelming process? And the answer is no. There is a one-volume Code of Jewish Law. That's it. That's the entire Code of Jewish Law. It's called the Shortened Code of Jewish Law. And what this is, this was a great sage. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried. And if you look at page... if you look on the tree of Halacha on page 158, he's all the way there on towards the bottom, the bottom, the lowest line on figure 4.2, the tree of Halacha, all the way on the bottom left. There's Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, authored in 1864 by Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried. What Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried did, he was a European rabbi, and he noticed that all that is overwhelming. And for most people, it's just going to be noise. Yes, in yeshiva, they study it, and anyone who studied in yeshiva can go through all of it. But for most people, it's just going to be noise. How does the average person just go ahead and know what to do with the law? So he authored this simplified Code of Jewish Law. It's one volume. It's translated into English. This is actually the Hebrew one, which is a one volume. The English one is in like 2-3 volumes because it's got the Hebrew on one side, English on the other. And what it is it's straightforward. It's very easy. It's very simple. It tells us what we want to do. So what we need to do. So it has 221 chapters. Some are very short, some are a little longer, but 221 chapters. The average is about 2 pages a chapter, so it's pretty simple. Each chapter has paragraphs or semi-sections that are numbered 1 through whatever. And it's very simple. So if I want to know the laws of Shabbos, I take out this book, the simplified, concise Code of Jewish Law, and I want to know the law. Am I permitted to tie a knot on Shabbos? So I look in the laws of Shabbos, and the laws of Shabbos in this book is only comprised of 25 chapters, whereas in the Code of Jewish Law, it comprises some 75, 85. I don't remember exactly how many chapters it has. In this law, it's only 22 chapters, and it's pretty organized. I can check the laws of traveling on a boat on Shabbos. I can check the laws of lighting candles on Shabbos, the laws of the prayers on Shabbos. So it's very, very simple. So say, for example, I want to know the law of what do I do first thing in the morning? So we open it up to the first page, to the first chapter. The first chapter is the laws of waking up in the morning. And there are 7 paragraphs in this chapter. So it's very short. It's 2.5 pages. And it tells me concisely, precisely, clear-cut what I need to do. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. Just like we saw earlier in the words of Maimonides in text 4, the laws of the Shema in very concise and precise form. This is even more simplified, even more simple. And so I guess my point is that let's not get overwhelmed by the amount of writings that there are and the complexity of the following section that we're going to study, which is to give us an understanding of how all these questions are constantly being analyzed. But for practical Jewish law, what you and I should do on a daily basis is a very simple, straightforward volume that we each ought to have in our own homes. You can buy it on Amazon. It's called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, or I think it's called the Shortened Code of Jewish Law. If you want, you can reach out to me after class for a link, and where I'll post it in the email, and you can buy it for your own home. And this way, for most basic Jewish laws, you have a basic understanding of Jewish law, you can just open it up and answer most questions yourself and have an understanding of what a Jew needs to do every single day. That being said about the Code of Jewish Law, let's engage in some actual halachic learning and get a closer look at some of the inner workings of the halachic process. How does the halachic process work? So say, for example, you're a rabbi and someone approaches you with a halachic question, right? And they tell you, I was cooking a pot of chicken soup and a few drops of milk fell into the pot, right? And we know we can't mix milk and meat. This is chicken soup, right? And milk is not allowed to mix with chicken soup. So someone comes to you and you're a rabbi and they say, a few drops of milk dropped into a chicken soup. Is the soup kosher or not? So if it's a halachic issue like this one that is directly and explicitly addressed in the Code of Jewish Law, in the Shulchan Aruch, then you would simply tell the person what the Shulchan Aruch said. You'd open up the Code of Jewish Law, you'd have a look. You don't even need a rabbi to answer this question. You can just have a look yourself in the Code of Jewish Law and it'll give you the answer. And the answer in this case is a very simple answer. The rule is it needs to have 60 times more than the prohibition. So for example, if there was 1 teaspoon of milk that fell into a pot of chicken soup and there's 61 or 60, depends, but let's say there's 61 teaspoons of chicken soup, this chicken soup is still permitted to be consumed. It's not considered non-kosher. It's not considered milk and meat. It's considered as if the milk has been nullified in the chicken soup, diluted enough that is no longer there, and it's considered non-existent. But if there's only 50 spoons opposing the 1 spoon of milk, that chicken soup is non-kosher and one is not permitted to drink it. Simple. But what happens if it's a more complex and complicated question? What if this particular question that you as a rabbi have been asked is not directly addressed in the Code of Jewish Law? How is a halachic decision reached? And so we're going to address one of the questions that we posed earlier on that map of the 35 questions. On page 150, we will address one of the questions. I'm not going to tell you which question it was, but these questions from these 35 questions were culled from a number of halachic responsa books that we mentioned in the video that I mentioned earlier. That's the halachic responsa of Rabbi Feinstein. These are basically questions that were posed to the rabbi and the response that the rabbi gave issuing his halachic ruling. Generally speaking, a responsa works as follows. The first 2 paragraphs, 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs, will be the question of the individual, the questioner. And following that will be multiple pages answering that question. Why do the answers go on for multiple pages? Because the posek, the decider of Jewish law, will cite and analyze dozens of sources from the Talmud, from the Midrash, from the Talmudic commentaries, from the Halacha codes, from the commentaries on the Halacha codes, previous responsa by other decisors of Jewish law, other poskim, in order to identify in an organized fashion what are the halachic issues involved in this questions and how were they treated by an earlier source. The posek will then weigh the merits of several proposed solutions, and then he will render his decision. So today we're going to analyze one of those responsa, one of those halachic rulings, the question that was posed, and the answer that was presented, and we will go through that answer as the rabbi took from the earlier sources, the later sources, up until issuing his ruling. And it's quite a fascinating question. It's quite a moving question. And we're going to have some fun going through it. As we proceed through this case study, you can refer back to the Tree of Halacha chart, which was on page 50, to track our progress. We'll refer to the tree, and you'll see there's a highlighted piece in the margin of your books, which shows which box of that halachic tree we are now addressing, and which timeline, to track our progress. So the halachic issue that, here it goes, the halachic issue that we're going to be tackling today is as follows. What do we do when two people are in mortal danger and we can only save one of them? Can we save one life at the expense of another life? Keep that in mind. That's our question. Two people are in mortal danger. We can only save one of them. Can we save the life of one at the expense of the other? So let's start. Our starting point in this discussion will be the value that the Torah places on human life. We all know that. We've heard the term pikuach nefesh before. Where does it come from? This value of human life, where does it come from? So this is where it comes from. The root of this principle is the Torah's account of God's creation of the human being, which states that the human being was created in the image of God, right? Text 5. Here's straight from the verse. God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Now, the Midrash teaches us something interesting. And the Midrash tells us that, right, so moving along, we did the Torah, now we're moving on to the Midrash. The Midrash tells us that the 10 Commandments embody the entire Torah. And Mechilta, this Midrash, points out that the Torah, the 10 Commandments are given on 2 tablets, 5 on one, 5 on the other. So in essence, there are 2 first commandments. There's the first on the first tablet, and there's the first on the second tablet. And the Midrash explains as follows. Text 6. How are the 10 commandments given? 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other tablet. On one tablet, it says, I am the Lord your God. And opposite, on the other tablet, it says, do not murder. This teaches us that anyone who spills blood, the Torah considers it as if they have diminished the stature of the Almighty. That's how important it is. That is the value of a human life. Spilling blood is like diminishing the stature of God. It's prohibited under any circumstance. This overriding value of human life results in what, in the language of halacha, is referred to as the principle of pikuach nefesh, which means, loosely translated, preservation of life. The pikuach nefesh principle states that virtually all commandments of the Torah are set aside in order to preserve a life. Let's have a look in text 6, once again, back to the Torah. The verse tells us in text 6, you shall keep my statutes and my laws, which a person shall do and live by them. I am God. And the Talmud derives from this law. Why does it say, and live by them? With all, says the Talmud in text 8. Sorry that I'm moving along a little fast-paced here. The Talmud says in text 8, with all the transgressions of the Torah, if a person is told, transgress so that you should not be killed, they should transgress rather than be killed. For the Torah states, live by them, not by them, die by them. So that's an important rule. Keep that in mind. What does the Torah tell us? The Torah in text 8 is telling us that a person should rather transgress a commandment than be killed. And that is deduced from the law in the Torah, or derived from the law from the word in the Torah that says that a person shall do and live by them. In other words, implying that a person shall live by them, not not die by keeping them. All laws of the Torah, barring 3, which we'll get to in a moment, but all laws in the Torah are transgressed to save a life, are put aside to save a life. That is the law, the principle of pikuach nefesh, preservation of life. Now, what's considered preservation of life? Is it only if a person has quality of life? Say, God forbid, there's a person who has 0 quality of life left, but they're still alive. Do we set aside the laws of Torah? And do we transgress all laws of Torah? Or is it only if someone who will actually have quality of life? who will have some sort of brain function, heart function, feelings, understanding, communication. At what level do we break the laws of the Torah? All laws, whether it's kosher, whether it's Shabbos, we break the laws. We say there's no laws of kosher applying. There's no laws of Shabbos applicable. Right now, the only focus is to keep this person alive. How about if a person is only going to live, if we save this person and we transgress Shabbos to save this person, we're only going to save them for 1 hour. If we don't transgress Shabbos, they'll die at 2 o'clock. But if we transgress Shabbos, they'll die at 3 o'clock. Do we say we don't transgress Shabbos because it's only for a short period of time that we're going to extend that person's life? Or do we say, no, we still transgress Shabbos? So once again, let's have a look in the Talmud. What does the Talmud tell us? Text 9. The Talmud tells of a certain scenario, right? Unfortunately, this was a practical scenario quite recently, right? We're all familiar with the earthquake that occurred in Turkey and right, and the devastation that occurred there, right? What happens if a collapsed building falls on someone on Shabbos? Even if it is doubtful whether they are there or they aren't there, and furthermore, it is doubtful whether they are alive or dead, we must clear the rubble heap from them. If the person is found alive, we continue clearing the rubble. So it's a small chance. Usually we follow the majority. And you might say the majority of people that are under this rubble are dead. So maybe we shouldn't transgress the laws of Shabbos. No, the law is that when it comes to saving a life, we follow even the minority of chances. If there's a 1% chance, if there's a 0.5% chance that someone is still alive under the rubble, we transgress all the laws of Shabbos to remove that rubble, to use heavy machinery, to go against all the laws of Shabbos, because there may be a 1% chance that someone's still alive there. And guess what? That's what the chief rabbinate in Israel directed the Israeli team, which was the second largest international team, to go to Turkey. The Israeli team of 450 search and rescue members, the Israeli rabbinate, chief rabbinate, directed them to continue searching on Shabbos. Because it's even if there's a 5%, a 1%, a 0.5% chance that there's someone still alive, we transgress Shabbos to save life. And not only that, the Talmud takes it a step further. Text 10. And the Talmud says if a person, the Talmud asks a question, if a person is found alive, in other words, when you're clearing the rubble, if a person is found alive, you must continue clearing the rubble heap from them. Says the Talmud, if a person is found alive, isn't that obvious? Of course, if a person is found alive, you continue removing the rubble heap. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us if a person is found alive, then you should continue? So the Talmud says, we take from here, in text 10, this needs to be stated in order to tell us that we continue our efforts even in the case that a person is mortally wounded and can only live a short while. So the Talmud is telling us clearly that a value of a life is infinite. It makes no difference if there's a 0.05% chance that there's someone alive, we transgress all the laws of Shabbos to save their life. And it doesn't matter if that person will have zero quality of life. It makes no difference if that person's life will only be extended for an hour. We push aside all the laws of the Torah in order to save that life, in order to save 5 minutes of a life, in order to save 5 minutes of a seemingly unproductive life. We still transgress all laws because the Torah puts infinite value on life, on human life. That's what it says in the Talmud. Comes the Rif, which, if you recall from the video, the Rif authored a digest of the Talmudic law, and the Rif deduces from here and from elsewhere in the Talmud. He writes in his commentary in the 11th century, he writes as follows in text 11. So we're moving along. Right? And he's right there. So we're moving along, and the Rif writes, a dying person has the legal status of a living person in every respect, as it is written in Ecclesiastes and Koheles, not until the silver cord snaps. And therefore he says, one who touches a dying person in any way that hastens their death is a murderer. Why? Because like we just saw in the Talmud, even a moment of life has infinite value. And so if someone hastens the death of an individual, he's dying. He's on his deathbed. He's a dying person. The doctor said he doesn't have 5 minutes left. He already is breathing his last. If someone touches that person and hastens their death by even 1 second, that person is called a murderer. So this is the first step in this responsa. And it's answering a question which we will get to soon. It's one of the 35 questions. So it's building an understanding of the infinite value of human life and the fact that we transgress every law in the Torah, right? So what we have here is we transgress every law in the Torah in order to save a human life. It makes no difference how valuable that life is. It makes no difference how long that life will be extended for. Any moment of human life, we transgress all the laws of the Torah in order to save. There are, however, 3 exceptions to the rule. There are 3 laws that we do not transgress to save a life. One of those 3, and I'm highlighting one because that's the topic of our discussion. One of those 3 is killing, the sin of murder. I'm not allowed to kill one person in order to save another person's life, right? You're allowed to transgress any law in order to save someone else's life, except for the law of killing, amongst other 2 more. You're not allowed to transgress the law of murder to save someone else's life. And this rule is documented in, once again, let's back to the Talmud, in a Talmudic passage, text 12. What does the Talmud say? A person came before Rava, great sage Rava, text 12, on page 164, and said to him, the chieftain of my village said to me, kill so-and-so, and if you do not do so, I will kill you, right? So the chieftain came to person A and said, told person A, kill person B, or I will kill you, person A. So person A came to the great sage Rava and said, am I allowed to go ahead and kill person B in order to save my life? Based on what we know until now, you're allowed to transgress any law to save a life of a person. Person A should be, theoretically, again, we're not talking about emotion, and we're not talking about heroics, and we're not talking about morals, we're talking about rules of the Torah. So cold, hard rules would seem to apply. I'm allowed to transgress the law of murder in order to save my life. Saving a life, I'm allowed to transgress any law in Torah. So perhaps person A should be permitted to kill person B in order to save his life. So he came to Rava with this question. What does Rava answer him? Rava said to him, let yourself be killed rather than that you should kill. Why do you think that your blood is redder than theirs? Perhaps the blood of that person is redder. What's Rava's logic? Rava's logic is that we cannot place a greater value on one's life over the other. Right? That seems to be his logic. Don't place, your blood isn't redder than his blood, and his blood isn't redder than your blood. Right? So if that's the case, why couldn't this person tell Rava, fine, I accept your argument that my blood is not redder than the other person's, but who says that the other person's blood isn't redder than mine? If my life is no more valuable than their life, neither is their life more valuable than mine. So why can't I kill the other person to save mine? So Rashi analyzes this question, Rashi, the famous commentary on the Talmud, and he analyzes this question, and he explains Rava's logic, and it reads as follows, text 13. Bear with me as we go through this. Rava is saying, your premise is that every mitzvah is set aside in order to preserve a life. So you think that also this mitzvah, the prohibition of taking a life, of murder, should be set aside in order to preserve your life. But this transgression is different from other transgressions in that, in any case, there will be a loss of life. The Torah only allowed the commandments to be set aside because of the preciousness of a Jewish life. But who says that your life is more precious in God's eyes than the other person's life? Perhaps that person's life is more precious, with the result that a transgression will be committed and life will also be lost. In other words, our starting point is that the Torah prohibits the act of murder. This prohibition of murder remains in force unless the Torah sets it aside. Now, in this case, we can't use the pikuach nefesh, the preservation of life principle, because yes, the would-be killer may be preserving a life, his own, by committing the transgression, but they're also destroying a life. And since committing the transgression does not result in the preservation of life any more than not committing it, the prohibition of murder remains in force. Therefore, says the Talmud, the prohibition against murder is an exception to the rule that one should transgress rather than be killed. So this law of murder is not allowed to be transgressed, and a person has to be murdered rather than go ahead and murder someone else. That's one law. Now let's move on to another dilemma. Let's call it the water jug dilemma. What is the dilemma here? And we'll contrast that case with this case. Let's look at text 14. It's an important dilemma. And we're getting to the point. Here's the dilemma in the Talmud. Two people are traveling, and one of them has a jug of water. Right? They're traveling in a desert, and there's no water for thousands of miles around, hundreds of miles around. And all they have is one jug of water left. If they both drink, both will die of thirst before they reach the next water source. If only one drinks, he will make it to a settled place and be able to live, and the other person will die. So now, what happens with this law? One individual, Ben Petura, expounded, better that both should drink and die than one should witness the death of the other. But then Rabbi Akiva came and taught, the Torah states, your brother shall live with you. The verse says, your brother shall live with you. Your life comes before the life of your fellow. So if it's between your life and someone else's life, save your life before saving your fellow's life, right? They say on the airplane, right? Cover your mess before covering someone else's face with the oxygen mask. So in this case, the halachic ruling follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. But the question is, how is this scenario different from the scenario earlier of Rava's case when the chieftain said to one person, kill me or I'm going to kill you? Why don't we also make the argument, why do you think your blood is redder than theirs? At first glance, it seems like both cases seem to be the same case. After all, both cases present the same moral dilemma. In both cases, I need to choose between my life and another person's life. So if Rava forbade a person to save their own life at the expense of another's life, it would seem that Rava would also agree with Ben Petara here and not with Rabbi Akiva, because Ben Petara applies the principle to both travelers. Neither is permitted to save themselves at the other's expense, and not with Rabbi Akiva. So why don't both of them follow the same moral understanding that a person is not allowed to save their own life at the expense of another's? Now, in reality, they're two entirely different scenarios. And when I say they're different scenarios, it goes to the heart of what moral choice is from the perspective of Torah and Halacha. One perspective, which is the general understanding, is who should live, me or the other guy? And that's the moral choice I'm being called to make in both scenarios, me or the other guy. And from this perspective, the two cases are exactly the same, right? In the case of the chieftain, who should live, me or the other guy? I want myself to live. and therefore I'm going to kill the other guy, so I should live. In the case of the water jug, who's going to live, me or the other guy? Me. So I'm going to go ahead and drink the water. Right? Your own life comes first. My own life comes first. My own life comes first in both cases. That moral choice isn't the moral choice of the Torah. The moral choice of the Torah that we have here is entirely different. I don't decide who lives and who dies. That choice is not mine to make. Only God decides that. The choice that I have is, what do I do? What should I do? What action should I take in this situation? Because regardless of what I do or what I don't do, we both may live, we both may die. God's in control. I'm not the one who decides who shall live. The choice isn't who will live and who will die. That's not our choice. What our choice is, what do I do in this situation? That is the question. And from this perspective, the two cases are not at all similar. In fact, they're very different. In the case of the chieftain, where the chieftain says to A, kill B, or I'm going to kill you, the man was asking if he was permitted to do a forbidden action in order to save his own life. And the answer is no. Because yes, it's true that almost all prohibitions of the Torah are set aside in order to save a life. In this case, one life is being saved, but another is being destroyed. Because we can say one life is more valuable than the other, the prohibition against the act of murder remains in force. And so the answer is, can I do a prohibited action? The answer is no. That's the answer in that case. That's the moral choice that you have to take. In the case of the jug of water, the question, what should I do in this case, is an entirely different one. I'm not doing anything to take the life of the other person. The water is my water, and I need it in order to live. The question is, am I obligated to save the other person if the only way this can be achieved is by giving up my own life? And the answer, based on the Torah principle of your life comes first, the answer is no, I have no such obligation to do that. And the proof is, if we change the variables of this a little bit, what happens if the person who has the water, the person who doesn't have the water, grabs the person who has the water and drinks it? One of the Talmudic commentaries explains that in that case, this individual who grabbed the water is actually prosecuted for murder, because he murdered the person who had the water. From a non-halachic perspective, the difference between taking action or not taking action seems not that important. At the end of the day, whether it's by action or non-action, I'm choosing who should live and who should die. But from the halachic perspective, the difference of the action is of primary importance. It's the only question of significance. I don't get to decide who lives and who dies. I have neither the authority nor the ability to determine that. The only thing I can and must decide is, what am I obligated to do or forbidden to do in this situation? And we have one final case before we get to the question that this halachic responsa comes from. Please bear with me as we go over time here, a few minutes. Text 16. The same halachic principle of, what am I to do? Am I allowed to do this act of transgression, or am I not allowed to do this act? Text 16. The Talmud, and it's the same law in the Code of Jewish Law, it's recorded almost verbatim, the way it is presented here in the Jerusalem Talmud, text 16 on page 168. If a group of people are traveling on the road and they encounter heathens who say to them, give us one of you that we may kill him, otherwise we shall kill you all. Even if all of them will be killed, they should not hand over a single Jewish soul. If this was a question of who shall live and who shall die, right? If the question is who shall live and who shall die, the question is obvious, right? I'd rather kill one, have one person be killed than all 10 of us be killed. But that's the question. That isn't the question, excuse me. The question is, what am I to do? Am I allowed to give over a person to be killed, thereby transgressing the law of the Torah of killing, or not? And the answer is no, because we're not allowed to transgress killing one person to save another person, because who says your blood is redder than mine? And the same idea goes with numbers. It's not numbers 1 versus 10. So one person is less valuable than 10 numbers. No. Life is invaluable. And so one infinite number versus 10 infinite numbers are both infinite. And if it's infinitely valuable, who's to say that one person is less valuable than these 10 people? Who says that these 10 people are less valuable than that one person? It's not up to us to make that decision. What it is up to us is, am I allowed to transgress this law of murder? And the answer is no. And if the answer is no, I'm not allowed to do that action. To hand over a person to murderers to be killed is an action that the Torah forbids, even to save another life or even to save many lives. So now, with these 3 halachic principles involved, now let's go to the question at hand. The question at hand was posed to a great sage. His name was Rabbi Ephraim Oshry. Rabbi Ephraim Oshry was a tremendous Torah posek who was born, surprise, in 1914. So we're talking about someone recent. What was fascinating about him was that although being in 1914, in the early 40s, he was a very young rabbi. But he was posed with a tremendous issue. And what was that issue? He was the sole halachic decisor that was in the Kovno ghetto under the Nazi regime. And as such, he was posed, many questions were brought to him. And many people still, under those harshest conditions, wanted to know what is the Torah rulings in many questions that up until those point never had been asked, and therefore they had nowhere to turn to other than a living rabbi who was able to address their questions. And fascinatingly, in those years, 1941, 42, 43, he transcribed his answers, the questions that were posed to him. He studied, he found answers, and presented the answers to those who asked him the questions. And he wrote them down. And shortly before the Kovno ghetto was liquidated, he buried those questions, he buried those writings, and they were found a number of years after the war, and they were published. Thankfully, Rabbi Oshry survived the war. He later moved to the United States, where he was a rabbi for many years, and he passed away in 2003. So it's quite recent, but his response is fascinating and tragic. And so this is one of the questions that he was posed. What was the question? You see, there were many questions that he had. He had some seemingly insignificant questions. For example, one question is, in the morning prayers, we say a blessing, blessed are you, God, King of the universe, for not making me a slave. And so those who were in slave laborers in a Nazi camp, they presented the question to him, do we make that blessing or not? We are slave laborers in the Nazi regime. Do we make this morning blessing, which is in every version of the prayer books, do we make that blessing or not? And he answers that question. To a degree, that's an insignificant question because it's not a life or death question. But the question that we're discuss now for another few minutes is the question as follows. Text 17, fascinating question, quite tragic. On September 8th, 1941, the 16th of Elul, 5701, the Nazi SS commander, this is what he writes in his response, and he wrote it in a lifetime as it happened. The Nazi SS commander Goke arrived in Lithuania. It was he who in the end liquidated the Kovno ghetto. That was added later. The reputation of this evil and bloodthirsty murderer had preceded him, evoking panic among those imprisoned in the ghetto. As immediately upon his arrival, he executed a number of Jews. At that time, there arose the issue of the notorious white cards. The matter was as follows. Jardan, the German commander of the Kovno ghetto, instructed the Jewish council to distribute among the workers in the ghetto 5,000 white cards, which he gave to them. These individuals would be the only ones allowed to remain in the ghetto with their families, while the rest would be liquidated. They'd be killed. At the time, there were about 30,000 Jews in the ghetto, including 10,000 workers. So now, only 5,000, only, what is it, about 15%, 20%, 18%, whatever. My math's a little off here. About 18% of the Kovno ghetto will survive, and it's all dependent on those white cards. So what was the question that was posed to him? I was asked, are those who were grabbing white cards for themselves to save themselves acting properly, knowing that they are preventing another Jewish family from being saved? Are they doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Again, we're not talking about here heroics. We're not talking over here about being a hero, which is a entirely different question. Yes, if a person wants to be a hero and give his life up in order to save someone else, he's permitted to do so. And throughout history, thousands of people have given their lives to save other people. We're talking about here, that's not what we're talking about here. And we're also not judging people. God forbid no one should ever be in such a situation. We're not judging people. Rabbi Ashri is not judging people either. The question over here is the obligation. Is it permitted or prohibited from the Torah law to do this or not to do it in such a situation? That's the question that was posed to Rabbi Ashri. And he goes through all those quotes that we just had before of your blood is redder than my blood. And the story with the caravan, give us one person or the other 10 will be killed. Or the chieftain who told person A not to kill person B. Or the 2 people who have the jug of water. He goes through all of them. He analyzes all of them. And he sieves through all the different opinions regarding these matters. And the question is as follows. There's 2 halachic precedents to consider, that he had to consider. The first one is the law that it's forbidden to take action that directly results in another's death in order to save oneself, right? That's the first law. So over here, they're taking action, grabbing the white card, which is resulting in the automatic death of another person. So was one allowed to grab a white card, or did they have to wait until the commanders hand out those white cards? But on the other hand, there's a law is that a person is permitted to refrain from saving another's life in order to save their own, like in the case of the judge. They're permitted to refrain from saving another's life in order to save one's own life. So is this one akin to taking action that directly results in another's death? Or is it similar to refraining from saving another's life in order to save one's own life? Now, the case of Rabbi Ashi of the white cards was somewhat different than both cases. No one is being actively handed over to the Germans, but neither is the white card already in the possession of the one who's stealing it. Right? So how would you rule in this case? In the end, Rabbi Ashri ruled that it was permitted for a person to try and save themselves and their family by stealing a white card. Where did he get this conclusion from? His conclusion was informed by the following laws. It's a quick 3 texts, and we will conclude with those. His decision was informed from the following 3 laws presented in the Code of Jewish Law. Text 18, 19, and 20. Let's have a look. A person on page 171, 172, and 173. A person who anticipates damage that will occur to them is permitted to save themselves, even though this will cause the damage to come to another person, as cited in the Nimukei Yosef commentary to the Talmud, chapter of Hashutav. Continue 19. However, as he concludes there, if the damage already arrived in their domain, a person is not permitted to remove it from themselves if that will cause damage to their fellow. And to conclude, the source of these laws is from the case presented in the Jerusalem Talmud. What is the case there? A person who sees that a water channel is about to flood their field. As long as the water has not yet entered their field, it's permitted to divert the water, even though this will cause another's field to be flooded. But once the water has entered the person's field, they are not permitted to divert it to another's field. And regarding a quartermaster, the same idea. As long as the legions have not yet arrived, person is permitted to bribe the quartermaster not to lodge soldiers in their home, even though this will result in the soldiers being lodged in someone else's home. But once the legions have arrived, it is forbidden to do so. So in other words, the logic here is as follows. Rabbi Ashri said that once calamity occurred, once the damage has already begun to occur, in other words, if the white card was already handed to someone, then it would be prohibited to steal. But over here, it's in no man's land. It's like that flood that's coming in the direction of your field, but it hasn't reached your field yet. You're permitted to divert it. You're not diverting it to any other field in particular, and you're not sending it to someone else's field. It's being sent by nature, by God. You're just diverting it from your field. But once it hits your field, calamity already befell your field, you're now not permitted to move it away from your field. So to over here, Rabbi Ashri concluded if a person was already selected for deportation, God forbid, they're not permitted to save themselves in a way that will result in someone else taking their place and being deported. However, as long as the decree had not yet been executed, each person has a right to try to save themselves, and this is not considered to be actively causing the harm to befall another. And therefore, Rabbi Ashri ruled that it is permissible to steal a white card from the ghetto council offices. So, with that, we conclude tonight's class. As we saw here, that halacha is the bottom line in Torah. No question is too big, no question is too small for the laws of the Torah. Next week, we will discuss Musar and Jewish philosophy. I just want to mention that in the indexes of